Right. Okay, so we have moved, going to move on to page 111. Right, and we talk about, right, okay, Toury and the descriptive translation study. From where here we are going to begin. क्योंकि इससे पहले the system where we finished last week was this previous theoretical frame given by Ibn Zohar. Okay, Chale, let's begin. So, as I just want to introduce this theorist, his name is Gideon Toury, and he actually worked with Ibn Zohar in Tel Aviv, that is in Israel, when he was working on his polysystem, जो उसका theory पे काम कर रहे थे. So he had the opportunity to work with Ibn Zohar. But after his early polysystem work on the socio-cultural conditions which determined translation of foreign literature into Hebrew, so after his early polysystem work, which was based on the socio-cultural conditions which determined the translation of foreign literature into Hebrew language, the Toury focused on developing a general. He came up and then he wanted to focus on developing a very, very general theory of translation. In chapter 1, we considered Toury's diagrammatic representation of, although slightly we touched upon was Toury presented his own with the help of a diagram, his Holmes map of how translation studies moved on. But in his own model, which is his influential work, which he calls as the Descriptive Translation Studies, which stands for DTS and beyond, which he published in 1995, Toury calls for the development of a properly systematic descriptive branch of discipline to replace isolated freestanding studies that are commonplace. So when he presented in his 1995 work, Descriptive Translation Studies, his objective was that he wanted to develop a properly systematic descriptive branch लेना चाह रहा था of the discipline, which would, instead of, he wanted to replace it with this isolated freestanding studies leaving that, which are very commonplace. He wanted to give something concrete, something very well developed, properly developed system. Okay, so what is missing is not isolated attempts reflecting excellent intuitions and supplying fine insights, which many existing studies. So what, according to him, he says what is missing is not isolated attempts reflecting excellent intuitions and supplying fine insights, which many existing studies certainly do, but a systematic branch proceeding from clear. But it was basically a systematic branch which proceeded from clear assumptions, and it was armed with methodology and research. What he wanted was to something, a systematic branch proceeding from clear assumptions, and it was to be armed with a particular methodology and research technique, which would be made as explicit as possible and justified within. And so this particular model which he wanted to present with research techniques which would be made as explicit as possible, and it would be justified kind of within translation. And this would be, presented or justified within translation. That is itself. Only a branch of this kind can ensure that the findings of the individual studies. This is only just a branch of this could find ensure that the findings of individual studies will be intersubjectively kind of testable and comparable, and the studies themselves replicable. So Toury goes on and he proposes such a methodology for the branch of descriptive translation studies, which he calls DTS. For Toury, these translations, first and foremost, occupy a position in a social. When for him, translation in itself, first and foremost, it occupies a position in the social and literary systems. He says that for him, he says that these translations, first and foremost, it occupies a position in the social and in the literary systems of the target culture, and his position determines the translation. And what does his position? And this position determines the translation images that are involved. So he looks about and he occupies a position in the social and literary systems of the target language, and this position determines the translation strategies which were employed. So with this approach, he is building and he's continuing and building. So with this particular approach, he's building and continuing and building on the polysystem or theory of work of Ibn Zohar, and it is on an earlier, somebody wants to join, and an earlier version of his own. So basically, an earlier version of his own work he wanted to, kind of present. And so with his approach, he's continuing and building on the polysystem of work, if you know, of this theorist Ibn Zohar. And he wants to continue and build on the polysystem work on which if somebody wants to join Ibn Zohar, they have to work, and then he carries on with his own work. And his earlier version as well, he moves on to that. And and he says that right, and then he's the Tory proposes the following three phase. He proposes three following phase of methodology for this systematic, descriptive translation studies, incorporating a description of the product. So what he believed was that how he would incorporate a description of the product and the wider role of what the social culture system would be divided, what would be devised of. He proposed that the following three phase methodology honi chahiye, systematic, which is based in this is his model of descriptive translation studies, and a kind of a model, wider model in which was based on the social cultural system. So he talked about three important points. So what were these 3 points? First is situate the text within the target culture, looking at a significance of that. So you situate, you keep your text, place the text, within target culture. जो भी आपने text select करना है, इसको करना है, you have to place it, you have to keep it in mind within the target culture system, and then you have to look at its significance or acceptable, whether it's acceptable, whether it's significant or not. Then you compare the source text and the target text. When you start off comparing the source text and the target text for shifts, identifying relationships between pairs of source texts, then kind of, according to him, he would like to compare the source text and the target text, and the purpose is to identify the relationships between both these pairs, these coupled pairs के term use कर रहा है, the pairs of source text and target text segments. You select certain segments of source text and target text, and then you attempt kind of making generalizations about the underlying concept of target. And if you look at the source text and the target text, and you see, you try to identify, relationships between these pairs of source text and target, and you kind of attempt kind of making generalized version about somebody wants to join about the underlying what is the concept of translation. दोनों को अगर आप compare करें source text को target text से a generalized version, and you come up with that. Okay, and the third factor was draw implications for decision making. So if you have kind of made compare the source text and the target text, or generally आपने in pairs को लेके you have attempt to make generalized rules in your opinion, क्या underlying rules है input which are involved in its translation. The third would be that you will be drawing your own implications, for say decision making in future translating कि आपने in sample जो comparisons से source text and target text को base पे करके एक generalized norms rules बना लिए, और उसमें फिर आप एक general implications बनाएंगे. You have come up with your own decision making in future translating. So an important additional step is the possibility of repeating phases 1 and 2 for other parts of similar text in order to widen the corpus. So an important additional step would be in terms of possibility if you're repeating phase 1 or phase 2 को आप repeat कर रहे हैं for other pairs of similar text in order to widen the corpus and to build up a descriptor. So in an important additional step would be in this way will be possibility of repeat करते हैं different phases को. Phase 1 जो अभी दिया situate the text, or 2 is comparing source text with that. For other parts of similar text in order to widen the corpus and to build up a descriptive profile of translation. So it would be somebody wants to join. We have to see that it would be a kind of, you are keeping these sample things as it is. This would be helpful for you in order to find out आप एक कॉर्पस सा एक डाटा बना लेते हैं. दैट इज व्हाट इज द डाटा इन विच यू गेट सैंपल्स ऑफ सोर्स टेक्स्ट एंड टारगेट टेक्स्ट. एक किस्म की आपके पास यू हैव अ डाटा विद यू कॉर्पस डाटा. In terms corpus data is which is kind of a data in terms of computer terminology जिसमें आप उसमें एक data you रख लेते in the memory of your computer. So in order to widen the corpus and to build up a descriptive profile, you will make up your own descriptive profile based on that data, into, kind of analyzing these pairs, their similarities, the differences, and all that. And then the descriptive profile of translation according, and then you will see that what is the different genres, what is the period, what is the author. You keep in mind other factors like the genre and period and author, etc. So in this way, the norms pertaining to each kind of translation can be identified with the ultimate. So if you look at this way, with this thing, with this ultimate aim, you will look at this descriptive studies, you look at stating what are the laws of behavior for translation in general, and what are the concept of different norms and laws for further discussions which you want to look up at that. So the second step of Toury's methodology is one of the most controversial. So if you move on to the second step, he says, which is more controversial. Why? The decisions on which source text and target text segments to examine and what the relations are between them is an apparatus with which Tory states should be supplied by translation. So he says that if you look at how the decision to in terms of source text and translation, target text को segments को, if you want to examine them, find out the relationship between them as an apparatus, this Tory would state would be applied, should be applied by translation theory. Yet we see, and yet we have seen in chapters earlier 4 and 5 that linguistic translation studies is basically far from reaching consensus to what applicable. So most controversially in earlier papers, published by himself, because as a theorist, when he evolved, when he came up with this, the way his theory improved and evolved. The earlier papers in 1978, then later on in 1985, Toury basically still holds to the use of hypothetical intermediate. So he basically still holds, still he sticks to his use of a hypothetical intermediate invariant or territorium comparisons, which is given on page 49 for discussion. And he presents this and he calls this as an adequate translation. इसको क्या कहते हैं? As an adequate translation. 18 against which to gauge translationship. तो एक ऐसा एक मॉडल बना लें जिसको आप adequate translation कहते हैं, with which you gauge translationships. However, at the same time, he also admits that in practice, no translation is ever fully adequate. But at the same time, he says that whatever translation work you say, you cannot gauge any translation, admitted that in practice, that no translation you will say that it is ever fully complete. It's ever fully adequate for this contradiction and for considering the hypothetical invariant to be universal, given he has he has been rounding and given he has been roundly criticizing it. So, and for consideration this hypothetical invariant to be universal, given he has been roundly criticized for that. So in his 1995 book, so published his book published in 1995, Toury drops the invariant. He drops the invariant concept. So in 1995 book, Toury drops the invariant concept, and what remains in his model is basically a mapping of TTT onto the target set. So in his 1995 book, Toury drops the invariant concept, and what remains in his model is basically this mapping. It's a mapping of the target text and the source text, which yields a series of ad hoc pairs. So in his book, if he drops the invariant concept, he moves on. He talks about finding of target text and source text, and he yields a series of coupled pairs of both of these. And this is the type of comparison which Toury admits. And this is a type of comparison which he admits himself, and it is inevitably it is partial and it's inevitable, partial and indirect, and which will undergo continuous and which will undergo basically continuous revision during the very analytical process itself. So during the very analytical process itself, it will undergo continuous revision and everything. Okay, so I hope it's clear to you. So it will undergo continuous revision during the very analytical process itself. So the result is a flexible and non-prescriptive. So if we look here, the result will be a flexible and non-prescriptive, if also less than rigorously systematically. The result will be a flexible and non-prescriptive, and if also we'll say that less than a rigorously systematic means of comparing source text with target text. Okay, and then the flexibility also leads to different aspects of text, which will be examined in Toury's series of case studies. Thus, in one study, is the addition of rhymes. So, if you look at as a case study of different texts, which will be, with, according to Toury's, his case studies of translation, he on one page it's the addition of rhymes and omissions. So if you look at it, it's on one page. There's are rhymes and omissions of passages in the Hebrew translation. So in the Hebrew translation of the German fairy tale, in another story, it's a conjoined phrases. So if you look at in another story or another study, we'll say that it's a conjoined phrases in literature translated into Hebrew. So we see that in one study, it's addition of rhymes and omissions of passages in the Hebrew of German fairy tale Kusne Liya example के, and we feel that there basically addition of rhymes and omission of rhymes add किए गए हैं but omit किए गए certain passages in this Hebrew translation of the German fairy tale, and another one he's a conjoined phrases in translation. So he evolves his own strategy in his own study as he picks this text and its translation. He comes up with these strategies. So the next further on he moves and he gives us the concept of norms of translation. So we have to see that what are the norms, what's the concept of norms of translation behavior according to Toury. So the aim of Toury's case studies is to distinguish trends of translation behavior to make generalizations regarding the decision-making process. So his overall aim, was in order to distinguish trends of translation behavior to make kind of generalizations regarding the decision-making process of the translator, and then to reconstruct, and then how he would reconstruct the norms that have been to, and then to reconstruct the norms that have been so in operation in the translation, and make hypotheses that can be tested by future descriptors. So if you look at this, his norms, the way he talks about decision making in process of translation, and then to reconstruct the norms that have been in operation in the translation, and then make hypotheses which can be tested by future descriptive studies when he goes on. So let's see that what, according to Toury, is norms. What did he mean by the definition of norms used by Toury is it's a translation of general values or ideas shared by community as to what is right or wrong, educate or inadequate into performance instructions appropriate for and applicable to particular situation. So what he talks about is that what is this, the according to him, what are these norms? Okay, so the definition of norms given by Toury is that the translation of general values or ideas which are shared by community as to what is right and what is wrong, or what is adequate or what is inadequate, what is right or wrong, or what is adequate or what is. This is into his performance instructions and what he calls as appropriate and what is for applications to make particular situations. So this he calls as norms. So these norms are actually socio-cultural constraints specific to a culture. So according to Toury, these norms are basically their socio-cultural constraints, which means that constraints which are placed by the culture and society, on anything, say on the source text, to a culture, society, and time. An individual is said to acquire them from general. So an individual would acquire these, you know, from general process of education and socialization. Uh, somebody, so an individual is said to acquire them from the general process of education and socialization. So in terms of their potency, Toury places norms between rules and idiosyncrasies. So in terms of, individual is required from general process of education, and he says they might acquire from them from different general process of education and socialization in terms of their potency. Then Toury also places norms between rules and education. Where does he place them? He places them between norms, rules, and idiosyncrasies, and he considers translation to be an activity. According to him, it is an activity which is governed by norms, and these norms they determine the type and extent. So translation for generally he places norms basically between rules and idiosyncrasies, and he considers translations to be an activity which is governed by norms, and these norms they determine actually the type and extent of they determine the type and extent of equivalence manifested in actual translation. So this suggests the potential ambiguity of the term norm. So although Toury uses it first as a descriptive analytical category and to be studied and through regularity of behavior, that is norms or options that translations are the translator in a given social historical context select on a regular basis. So they appear also to exert pressure and to perform some kind of prescriptive function. So although Toury focuses initially on this analysis of translation product, he emphasizes that this is simply, according to him, this is simply in order to identify the decision-making process. So he says that this is simply, initially, if you look on the analysis of translation product, and he emphasizes that this is simply basically in order to identify the decision-making process of translator. So his hypothesis is that norms that have prevailed in translation of a particular text can be reconstructed from data. So if he looks at this as, when he looks at the analysis of translation product, the product would be obviously the source for the target text. He emphasized that this is simply in order to identify that the decision-making process of the translator, and his hypothesis is that norms that have prevailed in the translation of a particular text can be, he says that these are not fixed, that if you, according to his hypothesis, that if you have devised, if you come up with certain norms that have prevailed in a translation of a particular text, for example, you can easily reconstruct them from two types of sources. Let's see what are those two types of sources. Number one, from the examination of text, the products of norm-governed activity. This will show up regularity of behavior. So you can do it either from the examination of text, the products of non-governed activity, and this will show up in terms of regularity of behavior, that is strengths of relationships and correspondence between source text and target text segment. And it will also point to the process. So it will also point to the processes which are adopted by the translator and hence the norms that have been in operation. And then number two is that from the explicit statements made about norms. So next he moves on and says that from the explicit say statements which are made about norms. तो जो explicit कुछ statements बनाए गए हैं talking about certain norms, by translators, publishers, reviewers, and other participants. So you can also even have some explicit, clear-cut statements which were made about norms, say either by translators themselves or the publishers, who would be the media people who are publishing, and the reviewers who read and pass on the reviews on the translation book. And it could be other participants as well in the translation act. They could also be, these statements, you could have these explicit statements given by these people, these sources as well. However, Toury warns that such explicit statements may be incomplete or biased. According to Toury, when he looks about these, the statements, he says that I generally agree that they might even be if you look at these, could be like explicit statements. They might be incomplete, or they might be what you say, incomplete होंगे or biased हो सकते हैं. They could be also biased in favor of the role. They also could be biased in favor of the role played by the informant. So either incomplete होंगे statements by them, or they would be biased in favor of the role played by the informants in the social cultural system, and are therefore best. So it would be best. They are the best thing is therefore best avoided. Further in terms of this. So Toury sees different kinds of norms. He moves on and talks about looks at different kinds of norms which are operating at different stages. When he looks at these norms, different norms, how they're operating at different stages, of translation process to the basic initial norm. So according to him, the basic initial or important or जो शुरू में एक norm होगा, he refers to a general choice made by translation. So this particular norm, the initial norm, which it terms, gives it the name as initial norm, it refers to a kind of a general choice which are made by translators. Thus, translators can subject themselves to this norm. So, what can these translators can do? They can subject themselves to these norms which are realized in the source text or in the norms of a target culture. So thus translators can subject themselves to the norms realized either in the source text or the norms of the target culture or level. ये norms कुछ भी हो सकते हैं. Either they could be the norms which are realized in the source text, obviously जो पहला text जिसको translate करना है, or it could be something like the target text, you could say, which will say that it will be inadequate, or if the target culture norms prevail. And if you say the target culture norms prevail, then the target text will be acceptable, and the poles of the adequacy and acceptability on a continuum. And if you look at these poles, find out what is adequate, what is acceptable, what is adequacy, what is acceptability. You'll find on a continuum, since no translation is ever totally. Because if you look at these norms and you say that you never find any translator और इस continuum पे देखें कि ये adequate है या ये acceptable है, इस continuum में ये two ends of the pole है, एक जगह adequacy के दूसरी acceptability. You say that since no translation is ever totally adequate or totally acceptable, hypothetically speaking, you cannot say that any translation would be 100% totally acceptable or adequate. So shifts and obligatory and non-obligatory inevitable. So it's inevitable कुछ changes होंगे, shifts होंगे, non-obligatory भी हो सकती हैं, obligatory भी हो सकती हैं, they're inevitable. So norms govern and a true universal of translation. But basic thing is that you have to see that norms govern and a true universal of translation, right? And then other lower grade norms described by Toury would be, as he explains his further model, and he talks about other lower, order norms which are described by Toury, which he calls them also preliminary norms and also operational norms. इनको ये नाम देते हैं operational norms and preliminary norms. Preliminary norms can be displayed. They'll be displayed in a figure 7.2. But translation policy refers to factors determining the selection of text for translated in a specific language. But he says that when we look about translation policy, it basically refers to factors which determine the selection of text for translation in a specific language, culture, or time. Toury does not pursue this kind. He does not actually pursue this idea in his case study because directness of translation relates to whether. Because according to him, when he talk about directness of translation, he says it could relate actually to whether translation is coming. Toury does not actually pursue this idea as it in his case studies, and he looks at directness of translation and he relates it to whether translation occurs through an intermediate language. It would be like if you talk about Finnish to Greek में उसने translate करना है, लेकिन it has been done through via English language. So it's like an intermediate language which is being used. So directness of translation would relate to whether translation occurs through an intermediate language, as in this case from Finnish to Greek via, or questions for investigation. Include you could have questions for investigation. It could include the tolerance of the target text culture. If you talk about whether the target text culture is tolerated to this practice, which languages are involved, and whether the practice is camouflage or not, or how is it presented. Okay. So operational norms describe the presentation and linguistic matter of the. So what are operational norms? He says that operational norms are basically describe the presentation and linguistic matter. So according to him, he says he uses the next term word used कर रहे हैं in terms of describing the idea of norms. There are certain operational norms which describe whether the presentation and linguistic matter of target text, and then matriarchal norms also, These relate to the completeness of the target text. So this matriarchal norms refer to the completeness of the target text, and phenomena include omission or relocation of passages, textual, segmentary, and addition of pauses. So if you look at these phenomena, it says, if you look at this omission or relocation of passages, textual segmentation हो सकती है, an addition of passages or footnotes. And then he says that if you look at this textual linguistic norms, they govern the selection of target. And if textual linguistic norms are looked critically, they analyze critically, you govern the selection of target text linguistic materials, lexical items, phrases, and stylistic features, and all that. Then the examination of the source text and the target. So he says that if you examine and clearly and critically look, and if you are to examine means that critically analyzing, critically looking, examining these two, the source text को कर रहे हैं and target text, then that should reveal actually shifts in the relationship between the two. So if you were to critically examine or look at the source text and the target text, you will reveal, it should reveal basically that there's certain shifts. It's not fixed. एक shift होती है in the relationship between the two that have taken place in translation. You compare this, in terms of, that means it's not an fixed, it might shift, it might change. So you compare shift analysis as given earlier in chapter 4. It's here that Toury introduces the term translation equivalent, and he included the term translation equivalence, but he's at pains to emphasize that it is different from traditional action of equivalence. So let's have a look at this figure 7.1 and see that what has to be explained by Toury in terms of his diagram. He presents this with the help of this figure, his initial norm and the continuum of adequate and acceptable translation, how it goes on, how it looks at these two basically factors, the initial norms and the continuum of adequate and acceptable translation. So ये दो continuum की दो extremes हैं. पहले आप initial norm को देखते हैं. So according to initial norm, you look at is you look at it is subject to source. If you look at initial norms, first of all, it is subject to source norms. कि जो initial norm जो भी आपने present किए हैं, it will be subject to some source norms. And then if it is source norms को आप use कर रहे हैं, तो that means the example would be adequate translation. That means adequate means that adequate, anything which is adequate, that means it's enough or it's okay. So initial norms एक present होंगे according to Toury, and then initial norms are basically subject to some source norms. The source norms are होंगे, and then if you the source norms obviously of the source language or source text, and that would lead to adequate translation. That it's a kind of a translation which is adequate. That means appropriate. Okay. So if you look on the other hand, these sort of initial norms, and these initial norms, and if you see, they are also subject to target culture norms. Okay. So if you see that any initial norms which as a translator you have presented and they're acceptable, and you say that they're acceptable to target culture norms को ये acceptable है. आपने जो initial norms present किए हैं, they're acceptable to target culture norms. So in other words, it means that it is acceptable translation. Why it is that means, here it comes the differences, that means the target culture, target text. If it is, your initial norms are acceptable, they're kind of subject to acceptability to target culture norms, that it reads, it is acceptable translation. ऐसी translation एक acceptable translation होगी. Obviously, you're translating it for the target organ, target text के लिए, target culture कर रहे हैं, target audience के लिए. तो आपने अगर target culture norms, have been kept in mind when you were initially formulating your norms, then it will be acceptable translation. Your end product will be something acceptable translation. Okay. Whereas on the left side, if you have initial norms which are subject to your source norms, that means source language, and then it would be kind of adequate. That means that would be also acceptable, but that would be an example of adequate presented. Okay. So I'm just moving on to two figures which are not there, but let me explain to them. and then I'll take another 5 minutes to conclude this topic. So, preliminary norms are basically translation policy and directness of translation. And operational norms are basically the matriarchal norms and the textual linguistic norms. So, if you look at these functional related concept by which he means that equivalence is assumed between a target text and a source text, this is very important because analysis does not then fully focus prescriptive on whether a given target text or target expression is equivalent to the source text or source text expression. So instead, it focuses on how the assumed equivalence has been realized and is a tool for uncovering somebody wants to join and somebody undertaking concept of translation and the derived footnotes of decision making and all that. Okay, and the factors that have constrained it. So as noted above, we're almost to the end of our topic. So as noted above, DTS, that is descriptive translation studies, aims to reconstruct the norms that have been in operation during the transit. So, if you look at basically in this way, we see that descriptive translation studies basically aims to reconstruct the norms that have been in operation during the translation process. However, Toury stresses that norms are a graded notion, since a translator's behavior cannot be expected to be fully systematic. So, in addition, these norms are of different tendencies, tendencies ranging from behavior that is mandatory, maximum intensity, to tendencies that are common. So, but they're not mandatory, and that is to behavior that is tolerated, minimum intensity, and which we discussed it will be discussed here. Okay. So, with this, we have come to the end of today's topic. This was basically Toury's descriptive translation studies, and it's also we have come to the end of this topic as well. ये जो आपकी वो थी ना system theories, so which we started last week. System theories is within this system theories the important these are two theorists who came up with the models. The first model, as you know, was presented by by the Israeli scholar Itamar Ivan Zohar, and which he terms it body system is more comprehensive, it's more detailed, it's more logical in terms of presenting, in terms of it would find its application in translation studies, more in terms of the way it is a blend of different systems. And remember, those systems were what? Culture ho gaya, it talks of, there are other factors relation to relationship. It's a blend of systems, culture, ho gaya, then literature and other factors as well, which are all part of that. It was anything text was taken in context of the relationship between all these sources, all these different models. Okay, so and then the second theorist is Toury, and Toury, what we studied or which I presented to you was in terms of Gideon Toury's his efforts and his initial relationship with Ibn Zohar when they worked together in Tel Aviv and how he came up with his system descriptive translation studies, and it came up, and his focus is on basically concept of norms of translation behavior, how it to be used in this model of his, and how it is used, and how it talks about initial norms, how it will be separated at adequate translation, how it works if it is subject to source norms, so it leads to adequate translation, and if it is subject to target culture norms, then it is a acceptable translation in the target culture. Okay. So, class, with this, I've come to the end of today's lecture. So, if you have any questions, you can ask me now. Okay. Because, inshallah, I'm moving to the next topic in the next class, जो आपके साथ अब होगी. Inshallah, I think end of week we'll move on to the next topic. So these were the two main theorists. You understand this? ये जो system theories के अंदर ये दो prominent theorists थे जिनको हमने study करना था. Okay, class. As my lecture is over, anything which is not clear to you, you can ask me now. And then you should also be mentally ready for your presentations as well. I'll make the announcement very soon in terms of how it will be conducted, because these are credit presentations on your, I'm sure you must all be ready. Okay, class.